On April 29th, 1945, units of the United States 7th Army approached the town of Dachau in southern Germany, unaware that they were about to encounter one of the defining horrors of the 20th century. Dachau was the site of the first Nazi concentration camp, established in 1933, and for 12 years it had been a place of systematic torture, starvation, medical experimentation, and mass murder. When American soldiers entered the camp that spring day, they found scenes of such overwhelming human suffering and depravity that many would be psychologically scarred for the rest of their lives. They found emaciated prisoners barely alive, piles of corpses stacked like cordwood, evidence of medical experiments, and a boxcar filled with decomposing bodies of prisoners who had been transported to Dachau from other camps. And they found the SS guards who had administered this nightmare. What happened in the hours after liberation, when American soldiers confronted the SS guards responsible for Dachau's atrocities, remains one of the most controversial and morally complex episodes of World War II. This is the story of that day, of what American soldiers did when they found Dachau, and of the difficult questions it raises about justice, revenge, and the limits of civilization in the face of absolute evil. The approach to Dachau began in the early morning hours of April 29th, 1945, as elements of the 45th Infantry Division and the 42nd Infantry Division advanced toward Munich. Intelligence reports had indicated that there was a prison camp of some kind near the town of Dachau, but American commanders had no clear understanding of what a concentration camp was, or what conditions they would find there. The concept of systematic industrial-scale murder was outside the experience and imagination of American military planners, and the intelligence briefings that mentioned Dachau described it simply as a detention facility for political prisoners and enemies of the Nazi regime. The first American units to reach the camp were from the 45th Infantry Division's 157th Infantry Regiment. As they approached the camp's perimeter around noon on April 29th, they began to encounter escapees and refugees from the camp who were wandering the roads in various states of physical collapse. These walking skeletons in striped prisoner uniforms told stories in broken German, Yiddish, and other languages that the American soldiers initially had difficulty believing. They spoke of systematic starvation, of random executions, of medical experiments, of gas chambers and crematoria, of conditions so horrific that they seemed to belong to medieval history rather than to the 20th century. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 157th Infantry Regiment, led his troops toward the main gate of the camp. What they found there froze them in shock and revulsion. Along the railroad siding near the camp entrance stood a train of boxcars, and inside those boxcars were the bodies of approximately 2,000 prisoners who had been transported to Dachau from Buchenwald concentration camp. The prisoners had been loaded into the boxcars with no food or water. The train had been shunted onto sidings repeatedly during its journey, as higher priority military traffic used the rails. And by the time the train reached Dachau, most of the prisoners were dead. Those who had survived the journey were too weak to move, and the SS guards had simply left the boxcars sitting on the siding, allowing the remaining prisoners to die of starvation and exposure. The sight of these boxcars filled with decomposing corpses, with body parts visible through the slats, with evidence of desperate attempts by prisoners to break out, had an immediate and profound psychological impact on the American soldiers. Many of the men were hardened combat veterans who had seen death and destruction throughout the campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France. They had witnessed the results of artillery bombardments, had seen battlefield casualties, had participated in urban combat where civilian and military deaths were intermixed. But nothing in their combat experience had prepared them for the calculated, systematic cruelty evident in those boxcars. This was not the violence of battle, but the violence of deliberate, organized murder on an industrial scale. As Sparks and his soldiers moved into the camp itself, the horror intensified. The camp was divided into several sections, including the administrative area, the SS quarters, and the prisoner compound. In the prisoner compound, approximately 30,000 inmates remained alive, though many were so emaciated and disease-ridden that they would die in the days and weeks following liberation despite receiving medical care. The living conditions in the barracks were indescribable. Prisoners were crowded into wooden bunks stacked 4 or 5 high, with multiple prisoners sharing each level. The stench of human waste, disease, and death was overwhelming. Dead bodies were mixed with living prisoners who lacked the strength to move away from them. The physical condition of the surviving prisoners shocked the American soldiers to their core. These were human beings who had been systematically reduced to living skeletons through starvation. Their eyes were sunken in their skulls. Their skin was stretched tight over bones. They moved with difficulty when they could move at all. Many had diseases including typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis. The medical personnel who arrived with the American troops immediately recognized that saving these prisoners would require extensive medical intervention, and that many were beyond saving despite the best efforts that could be made. As American soldiers moved through the camp, documenting what they found, they discovered the infrastructure of systematic murder. The camp included a crematorium with multiple ovens used to dispose of bodies, though at the time of liberation, the crematorium could not keep up with the death rate and bodies were being stacked in piles outside. There were gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, though testimony differs about whether these had been actively used for mass murder at Dachau, or whether they had been constructed but not yet put into operation when the camp was liberated. There were medical experiment facilities where prisoners had been subjected to hypothermia experiments, high-altitude experiments, malaria experiments, and other forms of torture, masquerading as medical research. The emotional impact on American soldiers of confronting this evidence of systematic atrocity was immediate and intense. These were men who had been fighting for their country and for the abstract ideals of freedom and democracy. Suddenly, those abstract ideals were made concrete. They were seeing with their own eyes exactly what they had been fighting against. The ultimate expression of Nazi ideology's contempt for human dignity and human life. Many soldiers wept openly. Some vomited from the physical revulsion of the sights and smells. Others were struck silent, unable to process what they were witnessing. And some were filled with rage, an overwhelming anger at the SS guards who had created and maintained this hell on earth. It was in this emotional context, with American soldiers confronting scenes of horror beyond their previous imagination, that they encountered SS guards who were still in the camp when liberation occurred. Most of the SS had fled in the days before the Americans arrived. recognizing that remaining at the camp when it was liberated would likely result in their deaths at the hands of either liberating forces or liberated prisoners. But some guards remained, either because they believed that wearing SS uniform would protect them under Geneva Conventions regarding treatment of prisoners of war, or because they had nowhere to flee, or because they did not fully appreciate the danger they were in. What happened next has been documented through multiple sources, including military reports, witness testimonies, photographs, and post-war investigations, though accounts differ in some details. When American soldiers encountered SS guards in and around the camp, a significant number of those guards were killed. The exact number has been disputed, with estimates ranging from a few dozen to as many as several hundred SS personnel killed by American forces during and immediately after the liberation. Some of these deaths occurred in what could be described as combat situations, as some SS guards did resist the American advance. But many others occurred in circumstances that clearly violated the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions regarding treatment of prisoners who had surrendered or been captured. The most well-documented incident of American soldiers killing SS guards occurred at the camp's coal yard, where Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks encountered approximately 50 SS guards who had been assembled and were standing with their hands raised in surrender. A soldier in Sparks' battalion, overcome with rage at what he had seen in the camp, opened fire on the SS guards with a machine gun, killing most of them. Sparks, recognizing that this was a violation of military law and the laws of war, physically intervened to stop the shooting, knocking aside the machine gun and ordering his soldiers to cease fire. But by the time Sparks stopped the incident, approximately 35 to 40 SS guards had been killed. This coal yard incident, while the most clearly documented, was not the only instance of American soldiers killing SS guards at Dachau. Throughout the camp and in the surrounding area, other SS personnel were shot by American soldiers, who encountered them in the hours after liberation. Some of these shootings were individual acts by soldiers who were emotionally overwhelmed by what they had witnessed and who viewed the SS guards as beyond the protection of normal rules of warfare. Some occurred when liberated prisoners seized weapons from American soldiers and used them to attack their former captors. Some may have occurred in genuinely ambiguous situations where SS guards made movements that could have been interpreted as threatening. The American military command faced an immediate crisis when reports of SS guards being killed reached higher headquarters. The laws of war and the Geneva Conventions were clear. Prisoners who had surrendered were to be protected, not executed. The U.S. military had court-martialed and punished American soldiers for killing prisoners in other contexts during the war. Military discipline and the rule of law required that the killings at Dachau be investigated, and that soldiers who had participated in violations of the laws of war be held accountable. But the command also recognized the extraordinary circumstances of the Dachau liberation, the psychological impact on soldiers of confronting systematic atrocities, and the moral complexity of punishing American soldiers for killing SS guards who had been complicit in crimes against humanity. General George Patton, whose Third Army had operational responsibility for the region, though Dachau had actually been liberated by 7th Army units, was one of the senior commanders who had to address the situation. Patton visited Dachau shortly after liberation and witnessed firsthand the conditions there. His reaction, recorded in his diary, was visceral disgust and rage at what the Nazis had created. Patton's view was that while the killing of surrendered prisoners was technically a violation of military law, the circumstances were so extraordinary and the SS guards' crimes were so heinous that pursuing prosecutions would be inappropriate. He reportedly stated that if any American soldier was court-martialed for killing SS guards at Dachau, he would approve clemency. An investigation was conducted by the Army's Inspector General into the killings of SS guards at Dachau. The investigation confirmed that violations of the laws of war had occurred, that a significant number of SS guards had been killed after they had surrendered or were captured, and that some American soldiers had participated in or facilitated these killings. The investigation specifically documented the coal yard incident and identified Lieutenant Howard Buchner, a medical officer who was present during the liberation, as having provided a detailed account of events. However, the investigation's recommendations about whether to pursue prosecutions were classified, and the matter was quietly dropped. No American soldiers were court-martialed or punished for the killing of SS guards at Dachau. The decision not to prosecute American soldiers for these killings was controversial at the time and has remained controversial among historians and ethicists. Those who support the decision argue that the circumstances were so extraordinary that normal rules simply could not apply, that the SS guards had placed themselves outside the protection of civilization through their participation in crimes against humanity, and that soldiers who had just witnessed the results of systematic mass murder could not reasonably be expected to maintain perfect discipline in their treatment of the perpetrators. From this perspective, the killings at Dachau were a form of rough justice that, while technically illegal, served a higher moral purpose by ensuring that at least some of those responsible for the camp's atrocities faced immediate consequences. Those who criticize the decision not to prosecute argue that the rule of law must apply even in extreme circumstances, that the laws of war exist precisely to prevent the kind of descent into barbarism that the Nazis represented, and that failing to punish American soldiers who killed prisoners after they surrendered undermined the moral authority of the Allied cause. From this perspective, the killings at Dachau and the decision not to prosecute those responsible represented a failure of military discipline and moral leadership. They argue that the proper response to encountering Nazi atrocities was to ensure that the perpetrators faced justice through legal proceedings, not to allow them to be summarily executed by enraged soldiers. The liberated prisoners at Dachau, many of whom witnessed what American soldiers did to SS guards, had complex reactions to these events. Some prisoners participated directly in attacking their former captors, seizing weapons from American soldiers, or simply using physical force to kill or seriously injure SS guards they encountered. These prisoners felt they were finally able to strike back against their oppressors, and they viewed the killing of SS guards as entirely justified, given what those guards had done to them and their fellow prisoners over the years. Other prisoners, despite everything they had suffered, were uncomfortable with summary executions and believed that the SS guards should face formal trials. The psychological impact on American soldiers who participated in or witnessed the killing of SS guards at Dachau was profound and lasted for the rest of their lives. For some soldiers, their actions at Dachau remained a source of moral conflict. They understood that they had violated the laws of war and the values they had been taught about proper military conduct, yet they also felt that their actions were justified by the extraordinary evil they had encountered. Some veterans struggled with guilt about what they had done. Others remained convinced that they had acted righteously. Many simply refused to discuss the events at Dachau at all, finding the memories too painful or too morally complex to process, even decades later. The liberation of Dachau and what happened to the SS guards became part of the broader historical reckoning with the Holocaust, and with the question of how societies should respond to crimes against humanity. The Nuremberg trials, which began just months after Dachau's liberation, represented a formal legal approach to holding Nazi leaders accountable for their crimes. These trials established important precedents in international law about individual responsibility for atrocities and about the concept of crimes against humanity. But the trials also faced criticism for being victor's justice, and the formal legal process could not address the visceral human need for immediate justice that American soldiers felt when they encountered Dachau's horrors. The treatment of SS guards at Dachau must also be understood in the broader context of how different Allied nations handled concentration camp guards when camps were liberated. Soviet forces, which liberated camps in Poland, including Auschwitz, generally killed guards on site with little pretense of legal process. British forces at Bergen-Belsen initially maintained stricter discipline, though there were reports of guards being beaten by British soldiers and by liberated prisoners. The American response at Dachau fell somewhere in the middle of this spectrum, with some guards being killed but with military authorities at least conducting an investigation and considering whether prosecutions should occur. The documentation of what happened at Dachau's liberation was extensive. Military photographers and journalists were present, and they captured on film both the conditions in the camp and some of the immediate aftermath of liberation. General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, ordered that the camps be extensively documented, that German civilians from nearby towns be forced to tour the camps and witness what had been done in their name, and that the evidence be preserved for future generations. This documentation has proven invaluable for historical understanding and for combating Holocaust denial, but it has also preserved visual evidence of the breakdown in military discipline that occurred when SS guards were killed after surrender. The long-term historical judgment about what American soldiers did to SS guards when they found Dachau has been mixed. Most historians acknowledge that the killings were illegal under the laws of war, while also recognizing the extraordinary circumstances that led to them. The incident is often cited in discussions about the limits of military discipline, about the psychological impact of confronting extreme atrocities, and about the tension between legal justice and moral retribution. Some historians view the decision not to prosecute American soldiers as pragmatic and appropriate given the circumstances, while others see it as a missed opportunity to demonstrate that even in the face of Nazi atrocities, the Allies would maintain their commitment to the rule of law. The survivors of Dachau who lived to see liberation had widely varying fates in the years that followed. Many died in the days and weeks after liberation, despite receiving medical care, their bodies too damaged by years of starvation and disease to recover. Others gradually regained their health and attempted to rebuild their lives, though the psychological and physical scars of their imprisonment remained with them forever. The survivors' testimony about conditions in the camp and about the SS Guards' treatment of prisoners has been crucial for historical understanding of the Holocaust and for prosecution of Nazi war criminals in the decades after the war. The SS Guards who survived the liberation of Dachau, those who fled before the Americans arrived or who were protected by American soldiers who maintained discipline, faced various fates. Some were prosecuted in war crimes trials and received prison sentences or death sentences. Others escaped justice, either by hiding their past or by fleeing to countries that would not extradite them. The question of whether justice was adequately served for the crimes committed at Dachau remains debated, with some arguing that too many perpetrators escaped punishment, while others argue that the legal proceedings against SS Guards were sometimes flawed or excessive. The ethical question of whether American soldiers who killed SS Guards at Dachau should have been prosecuted remains unresolved. There are compelling arguments on both sides. The argument for prosecution holds that the laws of war must apply equally to all combatants, regardless of their enemy's crimes, that allowing summary execution of prisoners undermines the moral and legal foundations of civilization, and that failure to prosecute sends a dangerous message that rules can be ignored when emotions run high. The argument against prosecution holds that the SS Guards had placed themselves outside the protection of normal law through their participation in crimes against humanity, that soldiers confronting such extreme evil cannot reasonably be expected to maintain perfect discipline, and that punishing American soldiers for killing Nazis responsible for Dachau would have been a grotesque inversion of moral priorities. Modern military ethics training uses Dachau as a case study for discussions about maintaining discipline even in extreme circumstances, about the importance of following the laws of war even when facing enemies who have violated those laws egregiously, and about the psychological preparation necessary to help soldiers maintain ethical standards when confronting atrocities. Military ethicists generally conclude that while the failure of discipline at Dachau is understandable given the circumstances, it nonetheless represents a failure that military training should seek to prevent in future conflicts. The story of what American soldiers did to SS Guards when they found Dachau is ultimately a story about the limits of human restraint when confronted with absolute evil. The American soldiers who liberated Dachau were ordinary men from diverse backgrounds, who had been trained as soldiers and who had fought through multiple campaigns. They considered themselves to be fighting for civilization and freedom against Nazi barbarism. When they encountered Dachau and saw with their own eyes the concrete reality of what that Nazi barbarism had created, their rage overwhelmed their training and their discipline. They killed prisoners who had surrendered, because in that moment, allowing those prisoners to live seemed like a betrayal of everything the Allies were fighting for. Whether their actions were justified or whether they represented a failure of civilization to maintain its standards even in the face of evil is a question that does not have a simple answer. The liberation of Dachau reveals the profound moral complexity of warfare, the psychological toll of confronting extreme atrocities, and the tension between legal justice and visceral moral outrage. The American soldiers who killed SS Guards at Dachau violated the laws of war and betrayed the principles they were supposed to be defending. But they also did what many human beings would do when confronted with evidence of systematic torture and mass murder on an industrial scale. Their actions remind us that maintaining civilization's standards requires not just laws and training, but extraordinary moral discipline that can withstand even the most severe psychological and emotional challenges. The legacy of what happened at Dachau's liberation continues to raise difficult questions about justice, revenge, and the moral limits of warfare. It reminds us that the distinction between justice and vengeance can blur in extreme circumstances, that even soldiers fighting for righteous causes can be pulled toward barbarism by rage and horror, and that maintaining civilization's values in the face of absolute evil requires conscious effort and moral courage. The American soldiers who liberated Dachau confronted evil in its most concentrated form, and some of them responded with violence that, while understandable, represented a departure from the values they were fighting to defend. Their story remains relevant today as a reminder of the moral complexities of warfare and of the ongoing challenge of maintaining humanity in circumstances that test the limits of human moral capacity.